O Lord, may we hear your word, not with our ears alone, but with our hearts, our minds, and our wills, to glorify your name. Amen. We can actually get this sermon over with quite quickly. I will just remind you that Jesus said you should love one another, and you can say, oh yes, and yawn. Because it has become a cliche, and that is a problem. Because cliches, of course, are things which everybody says is true, but then blithely ignores. And this, Jesus did not say lightly. He gave it. It's the only thing to which he does give the word a commandment. Well, from him anyway. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. And like all commandments, it's a problem, because they wouldn't be given. No one has ever commanded you that you should breathe. You do it. It's when things get difficult that you get commandments. And the difficulty with the commandments, well, one of the difficulty with this one, we can easily illustrate. Just look at the person fourth away from you. Just have a quick look. Who's fourth away from you? Right. What's their birthday? Now, look, that is a rotten trick, because I'm particularly bad at remembering birthdays. I'm not good on names, but I am particularly rotten on birthdays. I don't really expect you to know that. I've never forgotten my own wife's birthday, but that's because her birthday comes 10 days after mine, and whenever I get presents, I know it's time to leap into action. But knowing somebody's birthday is a little bit subtle, isn't it? But nonetheless, what do we know of each other? How do we relate to one another? And the answer is, to a very large extent, not a lot. Because we come to church and we say the peace to one another, but have you ever the peace said, hang on, I don't know your name, who are you? We go away largely unconcerned. If there is to be love shown, that's what we have clergy for. That's what they do, the pastoring. Now, that wasn't how it was supposed to be. And to change it, you would have to change the nature of the church. It would involve much more involvement. It would be much less a matter of coming and much more a matter of belonging. And I guess it would take some restructuring, and that would involve some commitment. But then the basis of love is commitment. And Jesus said, therefore you should be committed to one another as I am committed to you. Which he was to his disciples. He stuck with them through their frequently stupid questions, through their lack of understanding, and he has said this to them and shown his love to them just before they will all scatter and disappear. And he'll speak personally to Peter in a moment, and Peter will very shortly deny that he even knows him. It involves forbearance, it involves service. It's coming shortly after the story of Jesus washing his disciples' feet. And I think when he says, as I have loved you, that's very much in mind, doing this act of service, putting yourself out, picking up the burden when no one else will. To love one another as he loved his disciples and as they were to love one another. In fact, in spite of the fact that they were a very disparate group of people. if we began to get to know each other, then we would begin to understand that we don't like each other very much. A stranger is just an enemy you haven't met. Now, in the old days, of course, in a parish church, it was the village church, so everybody did know everybody and knew all their parents and probably knew their birthdays as well. So they would know the people in the pews next to them, and they would have a grudge against them because of what their grandparents did to each other. That is the second difficulty with the commandment. The first thing is actually to set it up so that we could love each other in practical ways, so that we could begin to be a community in a real sense of the word. The second part of it is making that community work. And quite notoriously, those little chapels and sects where people really are intimately involved are places of feuding and disagreement and gossip. And that's the second difficulty with it, is making it really work so that we do love one another as Jesus loved us. For what do we have in common? What did Peter the fisherman have in common with the John who wrote this gospel, who seems to be something of an intellectual? What did Simon the Zealot have in common with Matthew the tax collector, the collaborator? Not a lot. Start talking and you'll find that we have in this church fans of Jeremy Corbyn and of Nigel Farage. To put it no worse, and worse still, of Jeremy Clarkson. There'll be followers of Man United and of Arsenal. People who don't even like football like me, who prefer the balls elliptical. And people who are bored by cricket, etc., etc., etc. How do you make all that work? What unites us? Only one thing really unites us, and that is Jesus. Jesus who has chosen us, not we him. Jesus who calls us. The only thing we really have in common. So that should be what we talk about. And yet we hardly ever do. Listen to the conversation in coffee, and it covers all manners of subjects. Not usually Jeremy Corbyn and Nigel Farage, otherwise the coffee would be spilt. But the one thing it almost never covers is Jesus. I heard a story of someone who went to there are now churches for atheists. Not many, but there are one or two. They meet on a Sunday morning and I'm not quite sure what. Presumably they sing Prince songs or something like that. I don't know. But somebody went along to this for an article for the newspaper that I read. And the first thing the person said to them in the break afterwards was, "Hello, and how did you become an atheist?" If we don't know each other's birthdays, do we know anything of each other's faith stories? Do we ever talk about our faith? Because the one thing that unites us, we are united by our love of Jesus. And as the reading from Acts illustrated, by the fact that we are seized by his Spirit and united in our desire to follow him and to be holy as he was holy, to follow in his ways, obey his commands, and serve him in one another, and to serve him in the world. It's quite a commandment. It's very short gospel reading, but it packs a colossal punch. It asks us to do the most difficult thing, to love one another. The Bible, love is much less about how you feel about people and much more what you do for them and do for each other. It's a very practical thing. You don't actually have to like somebody to be loving to them. You can do it anyway through gritted teeth. And sometimes we'll have to. But that's how Jesus loved his disciples. Frequently, I think, with gritted teeth. Thinking, of all the people in Israel, I chose this 12. Am I the Son of God? I got it wrong this time, I'm sure. It's not easy. It's not easy to do. It's not easy to organize. But in a world which is increasingly isolated, I know preachers always think that the world is falling apart and it's their job to put it right. But it does seem that our society is becoming more fragmented. There are more lonely people. There are more people being left alone in their old age, with fragmentation of family and disorientation of relationships. A society where people loved one another really would be a sign. As Jesus said, if you had love one for another, the world would know you are my disciples. And if we got really, really loving, there might be enough left to overflow out into the world. And then we really would be acting like Jesus. And people really would know that we are his disciples. At the moment, what do they think when they look at the church? Would they know that we are his disciples? The answer always is the same from me. Yes, a bit, but could do better.